Hello and welcome to ChatGCP, a medical science, clinical research and commercialization podcast, and I'm your host, Charles Beasley. On today's episode, we have Dr. Chris Wynne. Chris is the Chief Scientific Officer at New Zealand Clinical Research. Chris has had a career of gigantic proportions and has been involved in a wide range of studies, including the pivotal trials that resulted in a functional cure for hepatitis C, as well as the pharmacokinetic studies for Juul, the infamous flagship vaping device of the late 2010s. In today's episode, you can expect to learn what makes New Zealand a great place to conduct clinical research, why the language of clinical research and science more broadly doesn't translate well into marketing, Chris's hopes for the future of clinical research in New Zealand and abroad, and much, much more. It's always great to speak with captains of industry, and Chris is no exception. On another note, today's episode is brought to you by SAPRO, your clinical trial pathway partner. Every clinical trial is unique, and the most effective solution is to engage in a distinguished and highly experienced project consultant who can tailor your trial needs and ensure that your trial is delivered on time with the highest integrity and with all risks considered. Engaging SAPRO as your clinical trial pathway partner will ensure delivery on your strategic objectives, keeping you and your collaborators on track, providing ultimate success and bringing your product to market sooner. For the small pharma or biotech company, SAPRO also offers a tailored full-service CRO solutions from start to finish with their team of experts and their highly reputable alliance partners. Check out the links to SAPRO's services in the show notes below. But now, friends, please welcome Dr. Chris Wynne. So I'm really excited about this conversation because I am very passionate about clinical research. And what I find more often than not is that people that are involved in this area, this industry, kind of arrive there by accident. I certainly did. Some previous guests who work in this industry certainly did. Didn't arrive deliberately out of university or out of their training. So maybe to start the conversation off, how did you get involved in clinical research?
I've had a very fortunate career. I trained as an oncologist and have spent the last 25 years in clinical research, early phase clinical research. But my very first clinical trial, and there's a little story here, that I did was as a house surgeon. Mm-hmm. So I just graduated, had a wonderful mentor who said, look, I think that in these young asthmatic children there may be a molecule that is overexpressed, and part of the problem with asthma might be that they retain too much fluid because of pressure in their thorax causing something with their blood volume because of the heart being under strain. Right. And so those were the days when consent was rather weak, and we slept in the hospital for a whole weekend, right? So at 3 o'clock in the morning, a nurse might ring and say, oh, there's a young child here who's got asthma. Do you want to come and take some blood? And the consent was done by saying to mum or dad, look, I would like to take another blood sample. Is that okay? And almost all said yes, and we spun the sample, froze it down, and that was my first ever publication. Going way back to 1980, 81. And the lovely thing about that story is there was a molecule that was overexpressed in young children with asthma. And this year, 40 years later, we're doing a study with that same molecule.
You've got to be kidding.
Wow. How the circle of medical discovery goes. It looks like it may have some application now in people with low blood pressure.
That's phenomenal. So the mechanism of action there of that molecule, I mean, you described it, so pressure in the chest, the heart not working perfectly well. Why don't we go into detail about that? Because that's really cool. I'm not prepared for this.
Yeah, well, I barely understand it as well, but I'm not going to say that out loud on your podcast, Charles. And I think it's one of the exciting things about research is that when we think we have the answers, we've got a long way to go still.
Yeah.
So here's a story that's taken 40 years to get to the
That's
clinic.
fantastic. That really drives home how long it does take to elucidate these problems. I mean, the human body is so unbelievably complex. Just because you found a molecule doesn't mean that you know where it fits, where it resides in the big proteomic map or mechanism of action or series of events that happen in a disease state. So, wow, so that's incredible. So is that New Zealand Clinical Research is working on a study on that molecule?
Yeah.
Wow.
So New Zealand Clinical Research largely does early phase clinical work. So there will be a biotech company or a pharmaceutical company who have discovered a molecule, discovered a pathway, where it fits in, and have done the testing in the petri dish, rats, mice, and monkeys, and we'll take it into the clinic.
Yeah, and that'll be normal healthy volunteers initially?
Generally, unless it's a drug with significant toxicity, say a cancer drug, and we don't want healthy young people to have the sort of toxicity that a cancer drug might cause.
Yeah, so that's fantastic. But I suppose the 40 years between that clinical research that you did in the 80s and then now, this is just kind of the getting on point for the clinical research pipeline, right? I mean, phase 1 study, then you got to do phase 2, then you got to do phase 3, and then there's post-marketing. So it's not as though it ends at the 40 years. There's another
maybe
5,
another
10,
decade, before that
go.
gets through the market and proven to be safe and effective.
Yeah.
Yeah, and probably 1 in 10 of the studies that we do on novel medicines, novel drugs, makes it through to market.
Yeah. I mean, it's not the greatest of success rates, but that's the nature of the game, isn't it? I mean, you need to have something that works, but is also tolerable, and the ratio, bluntly speaking, needs to be palatable.
Yeah, that's right. And pharmaceutical companies cop a lot of flack for unethical behaviour, but I can tell you that in the early phase space, they are desperate to eliminate a drug that has significant side effects. So as soon as there's a side effect that was unpredicted or is not going to be tolerated, that development of that drug's killed, it's stopped, dead.
Yeah. So the kind of work that you're involved in now with New Zealand Clinical Research, it's phase 1, early phase, that's a really large gate, shall we say, for crossing between normal healthy volunteers or for phase 1 into phase 2. If you design a study well and you find out that it's not going to be commercially successful or it's not going to pass muster through the regulators, then moving on to the next one.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something that big pharma companies can do easily because they have a number of molecules in their pipeline, maybe in the same class, maybe aiming at the same target that are just subtly different physicochemically. But if you're a little startup and you have one drug in your portfolio and you have some toxicity, then your company's gone. Yeah,
devastating, right? And often those kind of companies have had 20, 30 years worth of research that has taken them to that point, a bit like this drug being this new drug being an example. It must be devastating for someone who has really hung their hopes on.
And mum and dad have mortgaged their house to keep the startup going.
Yeah,
Charles.
Totally. Which really speaks to the high risk, high reward nature of the whole industry, right? And that's why you have big players more so than you do small startups. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the Netflix series that has just come out, Big Vape. It talks about the Juul, Juul, the early adopters of the vaporizer technology for nicotine administration. And they their whole shtick was, let's take people away from cigarette smoking and put them onto vapes, essentially, and then people won't die because this is safer. And the technology was developed more along the lines of a tech company as opposed to like a healthcare intervention. So it was this rapid pace, success at all costs. If it doesn't work, doesn't matter, just ship it out, get it out to the consumer. So that was quite an easy observation that healthcare is so much more complex than just creating a product. We've got to do proper testing, otherwise the product is going to be garbage, essentially.
Yeah. There are some books published about the Juul story where my name features because we did the pharmacokinetic testing for them in Christchurch.
Did you really? Wow.
And we got a minute to talk about this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is very
so I was working as an oncologist, and I had a number of lung cancer patients. Dying of lung cancer is a pretty unpleasant experience, and almost all of it is associated, not all, but most of it associated with smoking combustible cigarettes. And Juul came along with this fantastic technology. It was around a time when there had been electronic cigarettes. They were really crude, and they used a different form of nicotine, and you couldn't mimic the nicotine hit that you get from inhaling a cigarette. And so we did the pharmacokinetic experiments and compared a Marlboro Red cigarette, the one that has the cowboy that sits on the horse, and so the participants in the study smoked a standard cigarette, and we measured the nicotine level every 30 seconds over a 5-minute period, something like that, and then a Juul device.
Right.
And for the first time ever, we were able to show that the PK, the pharmacokinetic profile of an e-cigarette could match and match that of a combustible tobacco cigarette. And so suddenly, as an oncologist, I thought we have a tool that will allow people to stop smoking, get their nicotine hit. Nicotine's far, far safer as a single drug than when it's mixed up with all the other stuff that's in cigarette smoke. And then that was the end of my involvement, but Juul then went on and flavoured it with mango flavour and creme brulee flavour, and had a marketing campaign that was really aggressive, not designed for children or teenagers, but seemed somehow or another to have appealed to that group, and they got into a bit of trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. It was such an interesting story because they came from such genuinely admirable justification or mission statement to get people away from, and they said 300 million people, prevent them from dying if you can move them off from combustible cigarettes, up to 1 billion or something, which is very admirable. But it got kind of diluted through the tech development process.
I think once the marketing guys get into it and you have these aggressively profit-driven companies, they go off message pretty quickly. So we in New Zealand have probably saved lots of lives by smokers switching to vaping, but we've also had a relatively unregulated market where we now have a generation of younger people who are addicted to nicotine without any particular benefit whatsoever. It's a whole lot safer than smoking, but they never needed to get started vaping.
Yeah, definitely. It became a bit of like a social thing to do. You're out with some friends and someone's got the vape pen and away you go.
Well,
you would never have smoked a cigarette.
You're not going to stop.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not proud of it, but many years ago during COVID, I got into the vaping, and I was mowing the lawns at one point, and I had to have my vape pen on me, and I thought, okay, this is not right, and just quit straight away. It was very, very quite tough, but yeah, I mean, I wasn't a smoker. I might have had a couple durries with the friends, in the teenage, going out when you're 18, 19, but yeah, when you just pick it up because it's the fashionable thing to do, and then you're suddenly highly dependent on it, not great.
No, and so I asked myself, what was that the right thing to do? Or if I'd been involved in the development of some of the opiates in the states that have gone on to cause the opiate epidemic, how do you feel about that as a scientist, as a clinical scientist? I suppose the science needs to be done. We needed good pain relief. We needed a tobacco substitute. We can't determine what the consequences of that are, and you certainly can't put the genie back in the bottle once it's out.
No, that's right. And I think you make a good point that once the marketing guys kind of get their hands on it, and it does get kind of diluted a little bit, growth at all costs, capitalistic models, that kind of stuff. And if there's not checks and balances in place, there can be unintended consequences. And I think, the opiate is a really strong example of that as well, and Juul to a lesser extent, but definitely in the same vein.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the harm from vaping is significantly less than an opiate addiction, but we'll see how history looks back on that one.
Yeah, definitely. And this might be getting into kind of murky waters, but I suppose the similar thing happened with the whole COVID vaccine situation. I mean, the pharmaceutical companies, at least from my perspective, did everything that they were required to do under the regulations that they had to abide by. And then the messaging that was dished out by governments or, the media was a little bit disconnected from what was actually done in certain respects. And that's when it gets confusing, that's when it gets watered down, that's when it gets kind of complex and uncomfortable for a lot of people.
It's certainly been complex and uncomfortable for a lot of people, but I'm not sure that you're saying we should never have developed a COVID vaccine.
Oh, no, definitely not, yeah. We definitely should have, I think, but when it was never studied in pregnant women, for example, and then you have different regulatory agencies, different heads of state saying everyone should get it, including pregnant people, that's when it gets a little bit
Yeah, I guess we've already said, it will be interesting how history judges some of these things. I lived in Singapore during the SARS epidemic. Doctors and nurses died in my hospital.
Yeah.
So when COVID came along and we knew nothing about it, the only response was looking back, what is the experience when this class virus, this group of viruses, it goes feral, and I have only admiration for the speed by which governments and pharmaceutical companies develop the vaccine. And so how you apply it, I think, is your point.
Yes.
But the speed and the outcome and ultimately the safety of the vaccine, I think was an amazing feat.
Yeah, definitely. Didn't they? They just recently award a Nobel Prize for some of the scientists that worked on the mRNA technology.
Yes, that is correct. Yep.
Yeah. So you were in Singapore during the SARS epidemic, and then you came back to New Zealand, and that's when you kind of got full on into clinical research in New Zealand. Is that accurate? Yeah. So that's when. Did I see that? Did you get involved in Christchurch Clinical Studies Trust?
That's correct. So my colleague Richard Robson, Professor Robson, was a nephrologist and a clinical pharmacologist, and he had been doing sabbatical with Roche in the United Kingdom, in London, and at that time there was a threat of a flu outbreak, and Roche were developing Tamiflu, a medicine for influenza, and they needed to have 2 flu seasons in a year. And so they said to Richard, well, we don't have a phase 1 unit in the Southern Hemisphere. Would you help us set one up? And so on the back of his hard work, CCST developed, and then a unit in Auckland as well. And then both of those units got put together to form New Zealand Clinical Research 3 years ago.
Yeah. I didn't realise that's a bit of like serendipity involved, isn't there? Like that. Roche. Yeah. Professor Robson being involved with Roche needing a phase 1 unit, those two being put together, and that was the genesis of phase 1 research in New Zealand. That's remarkable. And the merger between the two units, is that really just to consolidate, have a one-stop shop, a bigger footprint for pharma companies, biotech companies that want to do phase 1 research?
Yeah, it brings together different areas of expertise, greater number of beds for dosing. It allows efficiencies in terms of systems, early phase research.
Not reinventing the wheel at other ends of the country.
Yeah, exactly. It's gone way beyond taking a pencil from behind your ear, licking the tip and making some notes on a piece of paper. You need to invest in systems to drive quality into clinical research.
Yeah, absolutely. So over the course of your involvement with CCST through to now, and the merger of CCST and ACS for NZCR, so many acronyms, fantastic. How has the landscape changed in New Zealand?
Right. Well, New Zealand's always been a good destination to perform clinical trials. We have a robust regulatory system, MedSafe, and the Standing Committee on Therapeutic Trials assesses every clinical trial involving unregistered medicines, and a robust ethics system. So we cover off those regulatory concepts really well, and have and an assessment of a clinical trial is done in a timely fashion. So that's what companies are looking for. And so why else New Zealand? I think we have a large patient population who, because of our pharmac system, may be relatively naive in terms of receiving modern medicines. And we have well-trained people on the clinical research side.
Yeah. Yeah, that pharmac piece, I mean, maybe that's throwing the cat amongst the pigeons, but it's almost like a double-edged sword. I don't know, on one side, it's a shame that we don't have access to those modern medicines, but on the flip side, it's kind of good for clinical trials because, like you say, a little bit naive, don't have access to the newfangled treatments.
Yeah, I think there's a third edge to the sword as well, that the concept of pharmac is good. It's not perfect.
So health economic assessment type thing.
Yeah. Brilliant. Applying some rigour to the assessment of the benefit of a drug. And, we're not the only country that do that. We just seem to have a lower threshold for what we're willing to pay for. Yeah. Or a higher threshold, depending on which way you're looking at it.
Sure.
And so the early phase research is largely in healthy volunteers. But as we move through into phase 2-3 studies, looking for patients, and the New Zealand patients tend to be, they understand why they're going into a clinical trial. They turn up for their appointments, and that applies to our phase 1 work in healthy volunteers as well. The retention of participants over a long study that might be, 6 months, they turn up for their visits. So we have different types of healthy volunteers in our studies in New Zealand compared to some other centres around the world where it may be a form of employment.
Right, yeah. And are there any stark contrast in normal healthy volunteers that you've seen in terms of that retention in other parts of the world?
Yes. Some of it's driven by compensation, and in some parts of the world, one of the biggest countries, the payment tends to be made in aliquots as soon as the work is done. And so if you're in the unit for 3 days and then get paid, that might be enough to get you out of town and you don't come back for the next appointment. But we've got to be good without damning others. So I'd rather talk about the positive stuff that we do rather than reflect on others. And our numbers that we look at in terms of missed visits very low, and retention of participants through to the end of the study. That last visit in a pharmacokinetic study is just as important as the first one.
Yeah, of course. Have there, over the course of those 15 or 17, 18 years, have there been any big highlights or amazing studies that you just look back and go, wow, look at what has happened since that phase 1 study that we were involved in, where that drug's gone?
There's one, Charles, that if I'm granted 10 minutes on my deathbed to look back at, I'll say I was immensely proud of being a very tiny cog in the big wheels of development of the cure for hepatitis C. So I hung on to the coattails of Professor Ed Gain, who's a hepatologist in Auckland, a global reputation, and Ed deep understanding of hepatitis C and deep connections with pharma and biotech companies as these molecules were being developed. And the first time, so hepatitis C is a viral disease that's the most common cause for liver transplant in New Zealand. And it's now cured with 1 tablet a day for 8 weeks. And there are countries around the world like Egypt where there are millions of people who have hepatitis C. It's an enormous drain on their economy and a terrible burden for someone who has hepatitis C on a personal and family basis. And they're curing millions of people. They have a national program to eliminate hepatitis C. Wow. And the first time the drug sofosbuvir was ever given to a human was in Christchurch, New Zealand.
Fantastic.
It's a wonderful story.
So it's a small molecule drug, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And man, that's fantastic. Because at the end of the day, I mean, it's very easy to talk about like the scientific interest and like the financial benefit for a company or a sponsor or just the people working in a high value industry. But at the end of the day, it is about the patients. It is about the end user. It might take 40, it might take 50 years, it might take 20 years or whatever. But that's the end user at the very end of the storied series of events that happen. That is what it's all about, right? I mean,
oh, absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely, and we get lots of feedback, particularly from these hepatitis C patients. A decade after their cure, we still have a guy bringing us a bunch of flowers out of his garden every year. So such a lovely story.
So I don't know too much about hepatitis C. So obviously, it's viral disease, embeds itself within the liver. The liver over time loses function. How does that?
Develops fibrosis, cirrhosis, loses function,
and then you either need a transplant or it's good night nurse, essentially. Yeah. And sorry, what's the drug's name? Sofosbuvir. So that eradicates the viral DNA.
Yeah. It's now in combination with a couple of others, but it does, and it's just it's a wonderful miracle-like story. There won't be another one in my career,
right?
Like that.
Yeah, it's almost like science fiction. When we hear of like, oh, you're cured of this disease or whatever, it doesn't happen that commonly. I mean, a lot of the treatments that we have available for a lot of things these days are more to manage the symptoms or to manage the progression or to just manage the disease in general. But it's very difficult to be curative. And this is a fantastic story of a proper functional cure forever from 8 weeks of daily treatment.
Yeah, tablet a day.
Fantastic. And isn't New Zealand Clinical Research doing some work in CRISPr as well with some biotechs?
Yeah. So we have multiple studies across a wide range of therapeutic indications ranging from brain cancer to fungal toenail infections. And when I tell that story, people laugh at toenail infections. And yet, in some countries around the world, maybe a quarter of the population have a fungal toenail infection, no treatment, really sore feet. They're not particularly mobile in terms of vehicular transport. They have to walk everywhere. So it is a problem.
Yeah.
And so we're working with a company looking at a potent antifungal that'll make a difference there.
Yeah.
So big molecules like antibodies, small molecules like aspirin or paracetamol, mRNA drugs, and then the class that may make more of a difference in the long term, but is very experimental and extremely tightly controlled at the moment is gene modification.
Yeah. I mean, that's proper science fiction, that stuff, isn't it?
Some of it's a fact now. That's right. Commercially available, treating diseases where there's a point mutation in a gene, fix that up, and they're normal for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
That's just wonderful, wonderful stuff.
We've kind of graduated from small molecule interventions into the kind of gene editing, RNA. The further we get, the closer we get to the genome where there is like an actual genetic mutation and we can intervene, the more effective. But and talking and speaking with some people that work in these fields, like antisense oligonucleotides and that kind of thing, RNA interference, they're a little bit, although they're closer to the genome, although they're further upstream of where the problem really is, they're actually faster to develop than some of the small molecules because they're more targeted. I mean, I had Dr. Sarah Diermeyer, who is the founder of Amyloid Therapeutics, and they're developing antisense oligonucleotides for link RNA, long non-coding RNA. So DNA dark matter, amazing stuff. But they can be in the clinic from benchtop science to being in the clinic, so clinical research phase 1 trial, within like 5 years or something. As opposed to the 2030, a lot of the fundamental science that needs to happen for these small molecule drugs. Yeah, it's incredible. So maybe over time the development will just be accelerating because we have greater understanding of both the human body, the mechanisms of action, genetics, and these really fancy tools.
That's true. But it may not be the whole answer. We have to ensure that the regulatory controls keep up with that. And you know that regulators are part of bureaucracies that tend to move more slowly. And so the scientists, the university professors have brilliant ideas, develop it in the lab, go, a lot of energy. But regulators have a responsibility to say, what are the consequences of this? How safe is this? Because their fundamental aim is to protect the population. And starting with an individual, but in general the population. I mean, there is science fiction that goes around viruses escaping. I mean, it's the stuff of good movies, right? So we need to be, or even did the recent epidemic start in a laboratory? You know, so and I don't have an opinion on that, and I suspect that it was not, but the regulators have a very real responsibility to protect you and to protect me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose some of these more cutting edge technologies have a bit of a probably make a few regulators sweat behind their knees.
Absolutely.
Like CRISPr, for example, gene editing, you're fundamentally changing the genetic code of an individual. That is ethically, untested or...
that's probably a separate conversation with someone who knows a lot more about the ethics of it than me. But my concern would be that if you have a single point mutation in one gene as part of the whole genome, are you absolutely sure that that's the only bit that you are editing and correcting? Because if you flip another gene, what's the consequence of that? And then can that be passed on 2 or 3 generations before it's manifest? So we have to be very careful. But I think it's an area of great excitement.
Yeah, and you can kind of put your tinfoil hat on and think about all the nefarious uses for technology like that, and it can get a little bit scary. But it's too much of a good thing, potentially a good thing, to not do some investigations in, but also, like you mentioned, set up a regulatory framework that is rigorous, that does protect people like you and I, but does enable some research to take place.
And I think that has to be a global regulatory framework, because you can't just have the FDA and the EU saying, well, these are the rules you're going to play the game by, and then players in other field in other countries
do their own thing.
Do their own thing.
And then that genome is changed, and that is out.
Exactly.
Crossing.
But we've got a lovely story of gene editing in amyloid disease. Amyloid can affect the heart, and the heart becomes a stiff and rigid organ and cannot pump effectively, and people die. It can be a familial illness. We have a story of a youngish man who had watched his brother die, who then started developing the symptoms of this, had a 1-hour infusion that eliminated the problem protein.
Wow.
And will never have that problem in his life.
Wow. So was that another single point mutation kind of thing, or a series, a few of them in one protein, so the amyloid protein, one change in one base? Downstream implications. That's crazy. I mean, I had a lady, Malvinda Singh Baines. She does a lot of neurodegenerative research, particularly in Parkinson's. But her, what she calls it, a model disorder, is Huntington's, and that's the CAG repeats. The more of those repeats that you have, the more likely and the earlier onset and the more aggressive your Huntington's will have. We all have it. And over time, it seems like there's genetic anticipation, like your children end up inheriting more of the repeats with each successive generation, which is quite interesting. But that'd be another one that would be, if you can, rip out a few of those CAG repeats from the genome, and then you don't have the aberrant protein, you bring it back into the normal realm of number of repeats.
Exactly.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
so maybe, in the last 20 years has been great, but maybe the next 20 years is going to be even better.
Oh, you're not allowed to have regrets in life. I don't have, but if I allowed myself to have one, it would be that I'm not 25 again, taking the blood in the middle of the night from that asthmatic patient, because who knows what the future's going to hold with the work that we all do today. I think it's going to be unimaginable 20, 30 years, There's still a lot of bad disease out there where we all have responsibility to apply our brains as best we can to making a difference. And some of it's discovering the molecule. Some of it's raising awareness of what clinical research is about. Some of it's about volunteering to be a participant in a clinical trial. My role's been to work developing systems and contacts with pharmaceutical companies to say, let's do good clinical research, and New Zealand's a good environment to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So where do you see the industry within New Zealand going in the short, maybe, and the long-term future? I mean, there are some headwinds. I mean, brain drain is one of them. There are demographic shifts that are happening as well. But I think the fact that we have people like yourself and NZCR, really doing some great work. There's also other phase 1 units that have popped up around recently in the last couple of years, which is fantastic. It's really signalling that this is a happening thing in New Zealand. Where to from here?
Well, I think it starts with the principle that the wealth of a country and the future of humankind is in here, and whilst it's important to have an agricultural base, we've got to do more than grow our economy by pulling milk out the tit of a cow. Right? We've got to use what we have here, and New Zealand's got a lot of advantages. I'm not going to go into them, but we have to grow our work, and we're limited only by our vision in terms of clinical research. It's a fantastic place to be as a medical practitioner, because every day you sit across the desk from someone and say, how can we do this better?
Yeah, I've probably said this a number of times, but I mean, we can't rely on the fact that in New Zealand, the grass grows well because it rains a little bit and it's not too hot and it's not too cold and it's not too dry, and we can't rely on the fact that we've got some nice, mountains and oceans and rivers in the backdrop that bring some tourists here. There needs to be long-term investment and commitment to high-value industries like clinical research that are going to keep us moving forward for the long term. I mean, who knows what's going to happen with the price of milk? Who knows if we're going to be shut off from other people, tourism-wise, in the future. So the underpinning of our economy has to be high value if we want to maintain our place in the developed world. I mean, should we put it that bluntly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's why again, going back to what you guys are doing, I think PCRN, they're another phase 1 unit on the shore. Optimal has expanded. That's another clinical research site. P3 Research, they've got a bunch of different sites up in another country. We've got Aotearoa Clinical Trials Trust that are expanding to other hospitals. Yeah. It's really happening, and there needs to be more awareness for people that will eventually come into those companies and replace the ranks that are in there as things progress. So I'm really excited about this podcast, talking with people like yourself, to inspire people to get involved in clinical research, but also medical science, medical technologies, and commercialization, because these are high-value industries and they are actually, going to be a thing for sure.
Yeah, that they are, and we can talk about the benefit to the country, but eventually clinical research is about the benefit to the participant, the patients, and you've alluded to that already. So what do we need to do? We need to ensure that there's talent in New Zealand. Let bright young people know that there's a high-value job in clinical research, and we need to raise awareness in the public that participating in a clinical research is going to give you a better clinical outcome.
Yeah, because that's probably one that is kind of hard for some people to comprehend, because they might see advertising for clinical trial and go, hang on, they're going to give me this, that, and the next thing for that. Oh, I'm not sure. Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But obviously, the process to get a patient over the line and sign an informed consent form is very rigorous and has to be approved by. You mentioned MedSafe, you mentioned the ethics committees, but then there does need to be that communication to the wider public, doesn't there too? Because it's no good just having the people. You also need the participants.
Yeah.
And then the connections.
Yeah,
with
phase 1
companies.
research is a little different to phase 2 and 3, where patients may get a benefit personally, or the information that we gain from them may benefit that group of patients with the disease that they have. Early phase research is where a healthy volunteer puts themselves up, says, well, I'll participate in this clinical trial. There's no benefit to me. I may be compensated for it. And that's a challenge for the ethics committee. How do you balance off risk takers like young people saying, oh, yeah, I'll do that because I want to be paid for it?
Yeah. I mean, you can't have an inducement, right? You're going to get paid, but you're not going to retire early.
Look, there are people who cut their leg off for the right amount of money, you know.
That's right.
In fact, the patron saint of surgeons, one of whom is Saint Damien, there are paintings of him transplanting a leg in the old days from an Ethiopian patient into a European patient, and so you have a painting where one of the first clinical trials, obviously, they ended up with legs of different colours.
Interesting.
I'd recommend everybody
story.
listening to the podcast looks out for that painting.
Oh, that's fantastic. Awesome. All right. Well, this has been an incredibly interesting conversation. I really do appreciate your time, and I'm really admire the work that you're doing and New Zealand Clinical Research is doing. Obviously I'm a massive fan of clinical research, being heavily involved in the industry myself. I really do hope that the industry within New Zealand can really grow so we can benefit, as you've alluded to, economically, financially, but also people can benefit, patients can benefit, and we have a really good thing going here in the long run. If people want to find out more about yourself, New Zealand Clinical Research, maybe getting involved in clinical research, where can they go?
Yeah, there's a website, New Zealand Clinical Research, nzcr.co.nz, and if they are interested in participating as a healthy person in a study or as a patient, they can register on that website.
Awesome. Thanks for your time, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Charles.
Cheers.